Psychological and emotional trauma for students in schools is a massive, massive undertaking when it comes down to people looking to address the clinical needs of people who suffer psychological and emotional trauma and trying to use those interventions in a school setting. So let me explain. When a person has psychological and or emotional trauma, we consider that in neuroscience as a manifestation of the neuroanatomical insult that is now measurable through SPECT imaging, SPECT, SPECT imaging of the brain. Let me go one step back and define it a little bit differently again. Ready for the layman? There is a physical insult that is in the subcortical part of the brain, the center part of the brain, that then leads to psychological and emotional manifestations, even behavioral manifestations. So as much as we talk about psychological emotional trauma as psychological and emotional, it is a physical insult to the subcortical region of the brain, specifically the amygdala, which is in the subcortical, which is the gland that houses your emotional content from the insult. Now, the insult coming in could be psychological, emotional, or behavioral, right? From a perpetrator or from a provocateur. It could be even involuntary, right? Involuntary, meaning you could be watching a movie like Marley and Me, which is a very sad movie that includes a man having to have his dog put to sleep, and it becomes traumatic. I can tell you, I was definitely feeling traumatized from that because I'm so connected to my dogs. Or it could be you heard a story through another person. Or here's a big one. I have a number of people that work, I know a number of people who work in hospital-based settings for psychiatric patients, and they read the files and struggle terribly psychologically and emotionally from the content they read of the people's history and insults that led to psychological and emotional trauma or even other psychiatric conditions. So the point that I'm trying to make is because there is a actual physical insult. If you look at a SPECT image, we see in the area of the subcortical increased blood flow. And in that increased blood flow, it saturates that area where the brain now is getting so much blood flow that it can't slow down or stop the ruminating thoughts that are resulting or that have resulted from an incident, an activity, an experience that had meaning attached to it. And because it was meaningful, keywords, ready? And it wasn't just stressful, wasn't just stress, it was distressing. Distress means it was inescapable, which then led to a physical insult to that part of the brain, which would be the subcortical area called the amygdala. Now, in that same area, we commonly see right down the middle center of the brain, we also see increased blood flow to the anterior cingulate gyrus. And that makes people rigid and inflexible. And what do we know about people? I'm one of these, or was one forever, suffering massive psychological and emotional trauma as a young person. As a result of my father being shot as a police officer, execution style, attempted murder. My father survived the sustained wound, but with a number of ongoing attempted murders or ongoing attempts to harm him moving forward. And that list goes on. It's a grimy story. But the rigidity in the thinking of the anterior cingulate, blood flow down the middle, when we see this hyperperfusion, increased blood flow, we know it's what makes people hypervigilant, hyper-astute, very, very dialed in on details. So what happens is with people who have this type of trauma, when a trigger, a relatable detail that reminds the brain, forget about you as a person, just reminds the organ, the brain, in the subcortical region of the brain, the center or the inner layer, in the limbic area, which is primatal, or what we would also call reptilian-like, right? Because it's from a gazillion years ago, that has no thinking capacity, that doesn't understand geography, and has no concept of time, and really only exists for three reasons: eating, sex, and survival. And in that area, the insult that gets stored very specifically in the amygdala, which stores, or the key word would be, was encoded with information of the experience. That amygdala becomes hyperperfused, saturated, surrounded by rapid blood flow, where often, not in all cases, but often, the brain becomes inflexible and hypervigilant to the details of the initial event that caused the initial insult. So what does that mean? Excuse me. So the day my father was shot, I remember all the police cars in the neighborhood. There were like hundreds. Police holding guns, just hundreds. Sirens going off all day long. And my family really, really revved up. My family carrying guns. I mean, this is back in 1972. These kind of things happened back then. When I hear sirens to this day, it alarms me. And it's actually worse just seeing lights. Not as much the sirens, because remember, the lights is what grabbed my attention that something was really wrong. Seeing my mother upset and not talking to me. My mother and I, super ridiculously close, even as when I was a child. And just see her upset, because she was never upset. She was always like the ambassador of safety, and everything was always good and all right. And then see her change. When I would see that affect in her moving forward, it would create an alarming feeling. And this is the problem in schools. When we try to address trauma in schools, we take people back to that initial situation. And that amygdala exposes, or it is prompted by a counselor to release those details. So through exposing those details, makes the person, the victim, the child, the student, feel vulnerable. And in that feeling of vulnerability, fires off a signal now to the adrenal glands, which is now going to boost epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's going to fire off cortisol, your stress hormones. It's going to push sugar into your bloodstream to give you strength just by talking about the story. And for people who are not going to be aggressive, maybe the trauma was the dog died. So there's no reason, like in my situation, I had to learn to shoot a gun. I had to carry a gun around with me everywhere I went. We didn't have witness protection programs, so I had to go to a police range, learn how to shoot a gun, and then carry it everywhere, worrying that people were going to come get me. I had to call my mother by her first name, not by mom. So I had direct communication with her. And then when people started coming to the house trying to get us, I had to sleep with a gun next to my pillow. And, the word gun, I can feel it, right? I can feel it. It elevates anxiety. When you're in schools and you're a school counselor and you're going to go into someone's trauma and you're going to open that door to make them feel vulnerable, the amygdala has inside of it a receptor called the AMPAR receptor. And it literally comes out of the amygdala. It removes itself to the external layer of the amygdala and is seeking, through stimulation, for more contextual cues or clues that there's a reason for this sugar to be pushed through your bloodstream, for your cortisol levels to go up, to be ready for a fight or flight with hyperperfusion, blood racing through your head. That energy races to your thighs. It's ready to make your legs run, races to your hands to start punching, grabbing, ripping. And what happens accidentally, commonly, and this happens in traditional psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a number of other things, is people who bring up these details and don't resolve the details by the end of the session leave the client, patient, student exposed and feeling vulnerable with high levels of cortisol, with an amygdala and an AMPA receptor that is hypervigilant, looking for contextual cues, and is ready to either defend itself, become aggressive in saving itself, or fleeing to free itself to gain safety. So what happens is sometimes clients, student, patients walk out of the room where they're receiving counseling worse than when they walked in. Very, very common that this happens by accident. So in schools, I get tons of schools around the world, whether they want to talk about COVID, they want to talk about the death of the parent, the kid being bullied is a big one. And they want to bring it up and go into the gory details. And while they're having the conversation, bam, the kid gets angry, gets upset, they cry, they get into a fetal position, they start clawing themselves, they grab something to defend themselves because you took them back into the actual experience that caused the insult, which is physical. You're now putting them in a neuropsychiatric, neuroanatomical function that now is manifesting behavioral functions for defense and survival, and the brain is not able to realize that they're not actually in the experience of the initial event that actually initially caused the trauma. And this is all happens by accident. I get it. But when people in schools say, hey, Buzz, we have 10,000 kids in our school and 90% of them suffer psychological emotional trauma. Can we hire you? Can we bring in a team? We want to do classroom, team-wide, group-wide, grade-wide trauma treatment for all these kids because they just can't learn and they're not thinking and they're all aggressive and they're hypervigilant and hyper-astute and suspicious and paranoid and overreactive and all these things. What do you think? And I say, we're not doing that. Not in a school. I mean, that's why psychiatric hospitals have locked doors, because when you're building out someone's treatment plan, you have to anticipate that by taking a person back into this very primatal, the limbic system, you're going to put them in a sympathetic function. And once they're in that sympathetic function, you can't snap your finger and bring them out. Unfortunately, when kids are walking down hallways, or I went through this as a youngster, I became very suspicious of everybody. My parents had me believe, because this is the way I was trained, and my father, who actually lived the gunshot, which we had multiple issues with recurring attacks. They tried to get to him in the hospital to kill him and a number of other things. And, I didn't know who to trust. So because I had to call my mother and my father by their first names, forever, I'm walking around not knowing. My family would tell me, you can only trust your immediate family. But, I had so many relatives in a small area. I didn't know who was a relative and who was just a friend, and third cousins twice removed and all that stuff. When I was walking through hallways at school, the overstimulation to that really would work me over, and I would get paranoid. And you have to think about this in schools, that if a kid was a victim of an aggressive behavior from other students who are peers, even if it was in a neighborhood, the sight of them, if it was heights, the size of them, their height, the color of their hair, the color of their skin, their nationality, the smell of them, the way they dress, the way they conduct themselves, who they hang with, what backpack they had, if it looked like they had something in their pocket that looked like it could have been a weapon, what tattoos they have, a large number of things that could contextually trigger to the amygdala that there could be a threat here, which then compels the AMPA receptor to come out like a periscope on a submarine, which now makes a person extremely anxious because you're boosting now cortisol, which makes you anxious anyway. You're hypervigilant. You're now in a function of worry. The highest level of worry to the primatal brain is next to suspicion, but the highest is paranoia, which is an extreme worry that becomes psychotic. And the person who's now being addressed, the student, client, patient, we're in a school, and we get the person to that level going back to the initial insult or repeated insults that they can remember. And as they're recalling it, they might not know that they're not in that situation that caused the initial insult at the time you're having this conversation with them. And we can't leave the child, patient, client that way, because then it's our fault if they overreact or they abuse somebody after they get aggressive or they can't focus. And let's say they had a test. They can't do it. It just can't happen, which is why I always suggest we create a parasympathetic school climate to the school with calming tools, with breathing, with gratefulness, with gratitude. And if we're going to talk about triggers, we don't talk about them in a way that they're triggers. We talk about triggers as stressors, and we talk about as maybe norms of stressors, like just being late for something. And what does that feel like? And how do we create cognizance so we can be mindful of the time and strategic with our strategy on how we're going to be able to still get to where we need to be on time without the derailment of emotion and upsetment by being pressured with time that can then cause us other consequences, right? So we got to be careful in the way we approach that, because the second we say something that can trip somebody up, like, just making up an example, you're talking about the concept of time and you're late, when you're late, there are going to be serious consequences that, and this kid is in class and he starts thinking, I remember when I was late for school, I just couldn't get up in the morning. I didn't feel well, and I made my dad have to drive me to school. And all the way to school, every time we stopped at a red light, he would beat me because I was going to make him late for work because he had to drive me to school. And I remember he beat me so bad, and he told me, you tell anybody about this, I'll kill you. And, I walked around all day at school worrying that I was going to tell somebody by accident and be killed. And so even when we're trying to do this kindly, we don't know everyone's story. I mean, there are horrific stories among children that people just can't even describe. I mean, I have some of the most heinous of stories that are unconscionable, about kids being starved and sexually abused. I mean, kids I work with. But we got to be careful on how we deliver this. What is the summary of this? We want to create emotionally intelligent school environments. And we just don't want to dive into and set kids up to be reactive, where they are victims of involuntary misbehaviors because we set them up to be reactive. And the reaction is anatomical, it manifests psychological and emotional. And if the insult was psychological and emotional, it will still encode anatomically and have psychological emotional effects. Could also include behavioral, psychiatric, or neuroanatomical. But lastly, we are responsible for them. So we have to be careful in the way that we create, even with great intention and effort, how we create interventions so we're not setting our students up to perform worse, to perform unhealthy, or to even be additionally insulted on top of their already existing insults, which would ultimately result in failure. And lastly, which is most important, we don't want a kid going home from school that same day feeling that uneasy feeling and then hurting themselves, particularly kids who go home unsupervised, which can happen. So we have to be careful of this. I believe in all of you and I believe in schools. It's my passion, but we have to make sure that we're creating environments that are conducive, not necessarily and always to recovery, but to the parasympathetic function of being safe, being responsible, and being respectful while we remain calm with cognizance. God bless you guys, and keep working so hard for our children because they are our future.